Good morning, Econ students. Today we're going to be doing Notes 4.3 on GDP. Your essential question, what is the GDP and how do we measure growth? Alright, so GDP is gross domestic product. We're going to look about how it's calculated, what influences it. So GDP, gross domestic product, is the dollar value of all the final goods and services produced within a country's borders in any given year. So this doesn't include the value of what we call intermediary goods. So intermediate goods are goods that are used in the production of final goods and services. So if we're producing something, if we have a factory, we're producing something, it counts the final product, but it doesn't count everything that goes into it, all the machinery and technology that goes into the final product. GDP is a measure that economists use nationwide to kind of look at how the whole country is doing, how much we are producing in any given year. So as you can see, GDP by country here, the United States typically has the highest GDP by country, followed closely by China. How do we calculate GDP? So there's two different approaches to calculating GDP. The expenditure approach totals the annual expenditures of all the final goods and services in the United States. So that's the consumer goods, the business goods, the government goods, and the net exports or imports of goods and services. The income approach instead looks at the GDP by calculating and adding up all the incomes in the United States. So consumer goods include all the durable goods, goods that last for a pretty long time, like refrigerators, microwaves, cars, things like that. And then the non-durable goods as well, goods that last a short period of time, like food, light bulbs, things that you only use temporarily for a short period. So there's different ways to calculate the GDP. For our class, we are not going to be calculating GDP, but that is something you might do if you take an econ class in college. So nominal GDP is measured in current prices. So if we look at the price, how much everything costs today in 2021, it does not account for the price level increases from year to year. Real GDP is GDP expressed in constant, unchanging dollars. So there are some limitations to calculating the GDP. It doesn't actually count everything in our society. So it doesn't count non-market activities, so things that people do themselves, like caring for children, mowing lawns, cooking dinner, all of those things that are required around a house aren't necessarily counted as part of the GDP. Those negative externalities, so negative side effects, as we know in econ, we call side effects externalities. Those aren't calculated as part of the GDP. So if we're thinking about factories, the pollution that they contribute to the United States or to the world, that isn't counted as part of the GDP. The underground economy, so you can think of this as like the black market or people who work under the table. So people who are making money, who are working jobs, but aren't necessarily filing taxes or making sure that they are being counted properly. They're getting paid cash under the table. And it also, of course, does not count our quality of life. So it counts money, how much we're making, how much we're producing, but it doesn't count how happy people are in the country as well. So that, needs to be considered as part of a country's success as well. All right, so other ways to measure, we have the gross national product, so the GNP. The GNP is a measure of the market value of all goods and services produced by Americans in just 1 year. The net national product, the NNP, is the measure of the output by Americans in 1 year minus the adjustments for depreciation. So depreciation is the loss of value of capital equipment that results from normal wear and tear. So if you think of like machinery or think of like a car, it loses value from just its normal wear and tear of using it frequently. The national income is the NNP, so the net national product minus all sales and excise taxes. Personal income is the total pre-tax income paid to U.S. households, so how much people get paid before taxes. And then, of course, we have disposable personal income, which is the money that you make, the personal income that people have after they pay out all their taxes. So what you actually take home on your paycheck is your disposable income. All right, so what influences the GDP? Of course, we have supply, demand, and equilibrium. So aggregate supply is the total amount of goods and services in the economy that's available at all price levels. Okay, so that's what we know from our last unit on supply and demand. The aggregate supply is the total amount of goods and services that we have available in our economy. As price levels rise, the supply rises. Remember that law of supply. As the price rises, the supply rises because people are trying to sell more items and make more money. The aggregate demand is the amount of goods and services that will be purchased at all of those price levels. So that's what people want, right? People have the ability to purchase those items. As the prices drop, the demand will increase. People want to buy more when the prices are cheaper, and they want to buy less when the prices are more expensive. That law of demand. And then the aggregate supply and aggregate demand equilibrium is when we combine these two curves. So we, map it out. We graph these where they line up, where each of these two curves hit is the equilibrium point. So the equilibrium point for the macroeconomy, so the entire economy for the United States can be determined. All right, so next we're going to look at business cycles. So a business cycle is a macroeconomic period of expansion followed by a period of contraction. So this is always going to happen in our economy. Things are always going to expand. They're going to go up on this graph here, expand, do better. The boom is at the top, and then we'll go into a recession, a depression, and then we'll go back into the expansion. That's typically how the business cycle works. So the expansion is the period of economic growth measured by a rise in the GDP. So the GDP, the real GDP, is going up. And then we have the peak, which of course is the top. That's when the GDP stops rising. It has reached its peak. It's at the height of the economic expansion. And then we start to contract again. So contraction is when we start to have that economic decline, marked by a fall in the GDP. When that contraction lasts a pretty long time, that's when we start going into a recession. So that's a prolonged period of economic contraction. This is like a severe recession that we had in 2008, that recession that we had in the United States, or like a depression, like the Great Depression that we had in the 1930s. And then the trough is the lowest point in the economic decline when the GDP stops falling. So that's the bottom point right before they start to go back up in the expansion cycle. So business cycles are affected by some economic variables. They are affected by businesses that invest. When an economy is expanding, firms expect sales and profits to keep rising, so they will invest in new equipment, new factories, new plants. That helps to create new jobs for their expansion. But in a recession, the opposite occurs. They start to close. They start to assume they're going to sell less. Interest rates and credit. When interest rates are low, companies generally will invest more. Consumer expectations. If we believe that the economy is doing well, we'll spend more. Whereas if we believe the economy is not doing as well, we're going to hit a recession soon, or we're not going to spend as much as consumers. And then, of course, external shocks can happen that can affect the business cycle. For instance, COVID, of course, none of us expected this to happen. So this was a pretty big shock to our economy. Lots of businesses had to close. Lots of workers got laid off. Lots of people on unemployment. That can definitely influence the output of an economy. So economists try to predict these business cycles, when things are going to do well, when things are going to start going into a recession. They follow the stock market, they follow interest rates, home sales, all of those things. But of course, the business cycle can fluctuate. So of course, it goes up, it goes down, it will continue to go up and down, but occasionally we will have big depressions, recessions, COVID, global pandemics that we didn't expect to happen that can affect the business cycle as well. All right, and economic growth. So GDP per capita, so GDP per capita means GDP by each individual person, is considered to be the best measure of a nation's standard of living. The basic measure of a nation's economic growth is the rate of the percentage change in real GDP over time. So as we know, we want things to go up, we want things to do better in the GDP. So we assume that quality of life will be better if the GDP is doing better, if the economy is doing better. And of course, each generation wants the next to do better in the future. And businesses try to improve their workers by what they call capital deepening. So this is the process of increasing the amount of capital per worker. So this is how businesses will make sure that they have better output from all of their employees. They can increase physical capital by purchasing more equipment. They could purchase new technology, new computers, new software to make the jobs easier and quicker to do. They can also increase human capital through training, through education, different sorts of training programs they can send their workers to so their workers can be more efficient. The proportion of disposable income spent to the income saved is called the savings rate. So, of course, we want people to spend their money to help the economy, but we want people to save their money as well so they can do better in the future. So when people invest their money, when they save their money in banks, that money becomes available for other people to borrow or for other people to use. So this allows firms to take that money to borrow it to deepen their capital. In the long run, more savings will lead to a higher output and higher income for the population, raising the GDP and raising the living standards. It's good for people to save because then other people can have that money and they can use that money. They can borrow it from the banks to do things like buying a house, saving for retirement, all of those things. Besides capital deepening, the other source of economic growth is technology. So, of course, technology is going to help us out. It's going to help us to be more efficient. It's going to make us have a higher level of output without using more input. So, innovation helps our businesses to grow. Of course, technology has helped us tremendously over the course of the past year when we have all had to go home, shelter in place, things like that. Technology helped us continue on as a society. The scale of the market can be improved as well. We can have larger markets using technology. And of course, we have increased education and experience with new technology. Increasing population can increase our growth as well. Actually, just saw a news story yesterday that said we are in the 6th year of declining rates in new births in the United States. So we are having less population growth than we previously had. The government can also affect growth by either raising or lowering taxes, depending on what they're going to use the tax revenue on. And then, of course, trade with other countries can affect our growth as well. And that is the end of your notes for today, so don't forget to write a summary, a couple sentences about what you learned about the GDP.